Well, greetings one and all, and welcome back to another video with your host Andrew. You join me for part 2 of today's video where we're going to be looking at filling mechanisms and some entry pens. So without further ado, let's roll the titles and crack on with this. Right then, ladies and gentlemen, before we get on with today's content, I have to say a massive thank you to Eric, who is possibly better known as eBear Inc. on Instagram. Eric is an absolute gem, an absolute star, and an absolute legend. Thank you so much. I really, truly, honestly, I can't begin to express how grateful I am for this this beautiful artwork. And that is basically me doing some urushi on a fountain pen. How wonderful is that? Yeah, last week was quite tiring, and I got home on Friday evening to this wonderful package, and yeah, I was completely touched to the point of almost being in tears. I have to say, it was such a touching gift. So Eric, thank you so much for your wonderful artwork. I will treasure this forever, and it will be found into a frame, and it will be then placed onto my wall. So thank you so much, Eric. Honestly, I can't thank you enough. Go and check out his account. I'll put a link to his account in the description below. Second bit of business, thank you so much for the overwhelming support on my first video in the Starter Fountain Pen series. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I've received quite a lot of comments already, but the competition is still open. So if you wish to have a go at winning yourself a Faber-Castell grip, then simply, again, follow the rules in my previous video, which I'm going to put a link to up above, and then continue. I'll also put the link in the description as well to that video. So on to the content for today. As I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to be looking at filling mechanisms, if I can get my words out. Mornings. And we're also going to be looking at some entry pens as well. So I'm not going to say these are the best entry pens because I've not tried every single entry pen. I think it's sometimes you come across videos where they say the best this, and it's such a clickbaity title, and I just want to try and avoid that. I know it's probably going to generate me more views, but I'm going to sacrifice views for just trying to be a little bit more open-minded, because although I love all these as entry pens, there are some which I definitely prefer over others. So without rabbiting on too much, join me in the next section. And again, I'll also put timestamps in this video. So if this next section doesn't interest you, which is about the filling mechanisms, then go and skip over to the entry pens, which I'll have that link down in the description below. Right, ladies and gentlemen, whilst not all of these are going to be entry pens, in fact only one of them I would consider entry pens, they all contain different filling mechanisms. Well, when I say all contain different filling mechanisms, we've got a cartridge converter, 3 different pistons, and I'll explain why I've got 3 different pistons, and we've also got an eyedropper here as well. So why have I shown you 3 different pistons? Well, that will become evident very shortly, because I want to just really highlight on this particular pen in a moment. Okay, so 3 different filling mechanisms we've got here. I'm going to open up this one here, which is the Platinum Plaisir, and as you can see underneath we have got a cartridge. This is the most traditional way of filling up a fountain pen. For a beginner, if you are getting into collecting fountain pens, this is going to get you going. Right, basically, you're not going to have any issues whatsoever if you end up using a cartridge. They're easy, you can switch them out, throw them away if you so wish, or you can use a blunt syringe to refill them with bottled ink. I'm not going to say that's more of an advanced technique, it's just a slightly more fiddly technique, and one which can get quite messy. I will probably talk a little bit more about how to fill a fountain pen in another video. So that is a cartridge. And essentially, they can contain quite a lot of ink, which is very useful. Okay, the next filling mechanism which we're going to look at is the cartridge converter, which is then demonstrated here with the Leonardo. So this is a Leonardo Momento Zero, and if I open this one up, As you can see, we've got a very similar system to that of the cartridge. The difference is it uses a piston, very similar to these 3 other pens here, but uses a little piston knob on the end to draw the ink into the pen. So you essentially just put the pen into the bottled ink, you twizzle down the actual knob till it gets down to the bottom, and then you twizzle it back up. And that's how you fill your pen with bottled ink. I will demonstrate that again in another video. But I wanted to try and keep this as brief as possible because I want to talk more about the starter fountain pens today. So, cartridge converter, really great system. The only issue with them is that they don't necessarily hold as much ink as other pens, and sometimes the actual systems can actually fail. They're not particularly reliable at times, and some manufacturers don't necessarily get you a full fill. Okay, on to the next one. Now there are pros and cons in all of these, and I'll try and talk a bit more about that later on. So the next filling mechanism, what we have is a piston. Okay, so actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to get my other pen out in a second, which is another Pelican pen, and I'm going to show you the advantage of having an ink window. So let's just move these out of the way. Okay, so a piston is essentially the same as the internals on the other pen here, which we got from the Leonardo. So this is essentially the inside of a piston filling mechanism, with the only benefit being that you can hold a much larger ink capacity. So if you are a person which likes writing journals or likes writing for pages and pages and pages in one sitting, then a piston converter might be the system for you. Not to mention, if you're going to use something like an elastic nib or a flex nib, then actually having a piston in there can be better because you've got a slightly larger aperture on the inside, which gives you the benefit of having some slightly increased ink flow. Well, that's what I've been led to believe. So to operate it, you actually turn the piston turning knob on the end. Now I have actually got ink in this pen, so I'm not going to demonstrate that for you now because you won't actually see anything happening on the inside either. But essentially what happens is that you just turn the piston turning knob and you turn it all the way down to the bottom and then you turn it all the way up to the top. Now there are systems out there which have got much more complicated filling mechanisms. There's one from a company called Alterhut where you have to depress the actual piston turning knob, and essentially what happens is you've got 3 stages of actually operating it, and on the 3rd stage you then end up filling it up in the traditional way. I think it's a bit of over an engineered pen, but there we go. And then on this one, you might be able to hear we've got a ratchet on the end, and that basically stops you from over tightening the pen. So it will continue travelling around. But it operates in exactly the same way as the aforementioned pen here from Leonardo. Now, on to the next pen. Pelican is that, unlike the other 2, which are friction fitted with their nib into the unit. Now a friction fit is when you literally just push the nib into the unit. If I were to get a piece of tissue paper, which I'm just going to do now. Right, so if I very gingerly undo the nib unit, as you can see I'm not managing to turn the pen like so, and we've now taken out the nib unit. Apologies about the focus at the moment, I'm just trying to keep it focused right down on the table. But I can then redo the pen nib back up again. Just wanted to demonstrate taking off the actual nib. That is extremely useful, and I'll explain why shortly. Lastly, what I want to talk to you about is eyedroppers. Eyedroppers are a system where you essentially just fill up the entirety of the barrel. From here down to here is full of ink. So if you want to have the most amount of ink capacity in a pen, that would be the system for you. Unfortunately, it's only limited to pens where you have got a all plastic construction, and there are no metal components in there whatsoever. Now there are some metal alloys which you can get away with, because there are some metal pens out there which have been designed for using with eyedropping, but they usually have a special coating on top to stop any sort of chemical reactions happening with the ink. So Maximum ink capacity, a larger ink capacity. I'll put that one there and this one. Both got very large ink capacities, and then the smallest ink capacity. I'd actually argue you can get more ink from a cartridge converter. Okay, so like in this Parker here, especially if you have a longer international cartridge in there. Now the disadvantage of some of these pens, okay, with an eyedropper, you're limited to what material you can actually eyedrop with, and also if you're a person which you're not enjoying the ink, you can end up wasting a lot of ink. Some people don't necessarily recommend actually putting the ink which you've put in a pen back into the bottle. I've done it in the past and it hasn't personally bothered me at all, but I've heard some people say that you shouldn't do that. Also, as I say, that certain metals won't work and they are more prone to leaking, so that is something to bear in mind. There, as I say, there are some other thinning mechanisms which I will talk about briefly, but I don't have any examples. Then with a piston converter, with the exception of this pen, these two pens, as I say, you've got friction fitted nibs, which makes cleaning pretty challenging. Now, Leonardo have actually just released a wrench for some of their Memento Zero Grandes and their new Magico pen, where you can actually disassemble the pen, but that isn't necessarily recommended unless you deeply need to deep clean it or reapply silicone grease. And silicone grease is going to help keep that piston turning knob well lubricated, because over time things can dry out and then the mechanisms can stop working. But on the flip side, you do get a tremendous amount of ink. Next, we've got the good old cartridge converter, possibly the easiest pen to maintain, because what we can do is we can actually take the we can take out the cartridge converter, and this one's unscrews, and then I can flush the pen out relatively easily. Okay, so I can run it through some cold water, get a bulb syringe and flush it through. Okay, and again, you can quite easily replace this if anything goes wrong with the pen. So there's a lot of people which swear by a piston converter. Now there are some more exotic filling mechanisms out there, and I'm going to talk about that now. The cartridge in here, actually I should really talk about this before I go on. The cartridge in this pen, if I just undo here, is a long, I think they're, I don't know if they're, I've got a feeling they're international cartridges for Parkers. I have a feeling, I don't think they're proprietary, I may be wrong. But anyway, the problem with some cartridges are that with certain manufacturers like Lamy, for example, they are proprietary, so you're limited to what kind of ink you use, unless, as I say, you use a blunt syringe. So that can be problematic. But generally speaking, they're no fuss, and you can throw a cartridge into your pencil case and you can start writing again. For a school student, I'd certainly recommend cartridges over any other filling mechanism, because you don't want to be writing for pages and then run out of ink. And whilst, yes, of course, you could take some bottled ink to school, the problem with taking bottled ink to school is that you might end up spilling it everywhere and your teacher will not be very happy. So now on to some other filling mechanisms. So back to my face where I talk about that. Right, so there are a lot of exotic filling mechanisms out there, okay, and there's possibly too many for me to cover in this video, because there has been some quite experimental ones, such as the snorkel filler, which was basically like an elongated tube which would come out of the pen nib, and I'll try and put some pictures in to support this. And what would happen with the snorkel will come out, you put it into your bottled ink, and then you fill it up. So it's supposed to be a slightly cleaner way of actually filling up your pen, and that was a system which was developed, I think, to try and attract people back into fountain pens in the heyday of when the ballpoints and rollables started coming out, so in like late 60s, early 70s. And it was a really interesting filling mechanism, and there are some companies these days which disassemble the old snorkel fillers and then they sort of repurpose them into new pens. There's a lot of purists out there which would argue that's a bad idea, but then that's really entirely up to you. Okay, so whether you decide to support having new change or not. Now, what was one of the oldest filling mechanisms was actually the eyedropper. So the eyedropper was potentially the first filling mechanism which was commonly used. And then we had things like Saftey fillers, which I'm going to put a picture to here. Okay, and essentially the Saftey filler was like the eyedropper, but the nib would actually retract into the actual body and then close up a little aperture, which would stop the ink from coming out. Then we got the piston filler. Now this isn't necessarily in chronological order, but we've got the piston filler coming from Pelican, and this has been the same actual proprietary filling mechanism which was used since the early part of the 20th century. So it's a really tried and tested actual piece of filling technology. And the benefit of this, of course, as you saw earlier, you can take out the nib unit and you can get quite a large quantity of ink. And on some of the pens, you can get a little ink window on there as well, so you can see the quantity of ink in your pen. We've had things such as the lever filler or the lever filler, depending whether you're English or American. And essentially what that was an internal rubber sac, which would have a little metal bar, and then you would essentially fill the pen by depressing the actual lever, and then that would suck up the ink into the body. And there's a very charming sort of action to it, and you can hear the ink gurgling up into the pen, which is very, very satisfying. The disadvantage to that is the internal sacs will eventually break, and then you have to send it to someone to get it repaired, unless of course you're feeling particularly confident yourself in terms of actually replacing it. But you know, they typically last about 2 to 3 years before having to get them replaced. So if you're not a person who likes maintaining pens, I would stay clear of that system. But if you want to have a nice vintage filling system, I'd certainly recommend it. Okay, then we started looking into things such as the power filler, okay, or the vacuum fillers. And essentially what that is a plunger system, which you could plunge down into the ink, and then it would have this counteraction in which once you press the plunger down and you go that last little inch, the ink starts rushing up into the barrel. And that has been a relatively commonly used filling mechanism from companies such as Anoto, and then Pilot has really popularised that in recent years with the 823, of both which I'm going to have pictures in the right and left hand corners. Okay, both absolutely fantastic filling mechanisms. Just absolutely beautiful, and again you can contain quite a lot of ink with those mechanisms. And then of course we've had some experimental systems like the bulk filler from Konid, which is a very complicated filling system, but it works, and there's a lot of people which just gush over those. They are quite well produced pens. Will we see any more filling mechanisms going forwards? Quite possibly. I wouldn't be surprised if one day there will be a company which designs a smart pen. What filling mechanism they use, I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised one day you'll get an internal sensor in your pen which says, "You're almost out of ink. Would you like me to order some?" And then you'll just say to your favourite voice assistant, "Yes, please, order me some ink." And then you'll get some ink come through. So I can see that coming in the future if fountain pens get to a point of popularity. Gimmicky? Yes. Fun? That's just down to you. But I think that might come one day. And actually, in all honesty, if you've got a pen which has got a completely opaque barrel, like say on this Leonardo here, having an internal way of being able to know how much ink you've got in there wouldn't actually be a bad idea. Obviously, having some internal sensor system in there might be challenging, but yeah. Anyway, enough rabbiting on. What we're going to go on to now is having a look at some entry pens. So join me in the next section. So ladies and gentlemen, I've got a fistful of pens here which was kindly gifted to me from Cult Pens for the purpose of this review. And what I'm going to try and talk to you about is each pen and give you a little bit of an overview to some of their special characteristics. So last week we talked a little bit about the comfort of fountain pens, and in particular we looked at the grip, we looked at the Kaweco, and we looked at the Monami, and we also looked at the Lamy Safari. But I'll go over these again and talk about some of those features in case you missed that video. I'm not going to talk about the comfort because you can see that video in its entirety. But let's start from the cheapest pen and work our way up. Now, in my initial testing of this Monami, yeah, I'll just have to keep on thinking of Namiki, which is one of my favourite brands, but Monami do this lovely Olika in extra fine. And whilst I'm not a fan of the ink, I am a massive, massive fan of the nib, and I am a massive fan of this grip section. And at £3.49, you're not going to go wrong with this pen. I'm not going to talk about the parts and features in general like I do in my other reviews, because it would make this video too long today. But you do get a really good nib, you get a pretty decent ink cartridge, and you'll have a very pleasant writing experience, especially at £3.49. My recommendation, if you were to get this pen, buy your own cartridges, because I have noticed on some papers this ink does have a tendency to feather. Feathering is when the ink basically just goes out, okay, and it then just spreads across the page and it looks a little bit messy. So the Monami at £3.49 is a perfect entry pen if you're a school student. If you are a writer, I would maybe recommend going up to some other pens later on. Next up, we are going to have a look at this possibly one of the most well-known fountain pens in the fountain pen world. And it's sold millions and millions of units of this pen. And this is Platinum's most popular pen. And that is the Platinum Preppy, which I shall hold the right way up. Again, these come in a variety of different nib grades. But one thing which you should note, both with the Plaisir and with this, Japanese nibs tend to be on the slightly finer side, and that's just to make, well, basically to marry up with their, basically their sort of writing style. So you are going to get yourself a finer nib than, say, perhaps if you went with a Lamy Safari. Now this is a Japanese fine, I believe, and this is an extra fine, and they both write fairly similarly. The benefit of this pen is that although the actual ink cartridge in here does come supplied, you can eyedrop this pen like I mentioned before, so you can fill up the entirety of this pen with ink. All you just need is a little rubber O-ring, and you need some silicone grease on the threads, and then you've got a fantastic pen. Now there's another proprietary system in here. You'll notice that actually there's an internal cup, okay, and a little spring. So what happens is when you actually put this pen in with the snap cap, it presses the cup over the nib, and it's guaranteed this pen to write if you don't pick it up for over a year. So this really is a fantastic pen. And the Plaisir, which I'm going to show you very shortly, has the same actual mechanism. Next up, I'm going to talk to you about the Kaweco Perkeo. And this again is a really lovely entry pen, especially designed for school students, because we've got these faceted sides. Makes for a very comfortable grip, and it trains you to hold the pen correctly, because you can't help but hold it by the facets. The nib is absolutely fantastic, and when we go over to doing a writing sample with these pens in a moment, you'll just see how wonderful this nib is. Now this is again an all plastic construction, so if you want to eyedrop this pen you can, and you can put in a cartridge converter if you so wish, which is extremely useful, because the filling capacity of this on the standard cartridge isn't that massive. Now you'll also notice on this pen there is no clip, okay, but we have got these faceted sides, so if I was to put this down on a table, then you'll notice that it won't actually roll off the table, which is great. Really good for pencil cases. No clip on here, it's not going to get in the way of other implements. And being all plastic, if you wanted to do some urushi lacquer to this, or if you wanted to do some painting, then you would have a really beautiful pen. I think actually upcycling this pen with some urushi lacquer would look just superb. I know having facets on a pen can be quite challenging for urushi artists, but you know what? I might actually send this off to an urushi artist to see what they can do. Okay, next up, I'm going to show you what's probably one of the best known fountain pens in the world beyond the Platinum Preppy, and that is the Lamy Safari. So why the Lamy Safari? It's iconic, really. We've got this very sort of Bauhaus-like design with the clip. The simplicity of the colours, the range of colours these come in is just breathtaking. You can get the colours of the rainbow with this pen, and it's one of the most collectible pens which you can actually affordably buy, I would argue. You also get an ink window on here, which is beautiful. Now, there's been a lot of companies from around the world which have tried to copy this design. Most notably, there are companies from China which have copied it. So that really does go to show how popular a pen this really truly is. And these can retail from anything from about £15 to £25. Just depending on where you buy it and whether it's a special edition or a standard edition like this one here. Really good value money. Again, we've got a triangular grip section here, fantastic nib, and they are really easy to take off. All you just need is some little rubber gloves, pull it, and they come off very, very easily. And if you want, you can even put on a 14-karat gold nib if you're feeling particularly extra or particularly special. So yes, you can upgrade the nib, and they are interchangeable throughout their range. Okay, next up, we're going to have a look at possibly, I think, my favourite writer out of the group, and that is the Faber-Castell grip. What I particularly love about this pen is how comfortable the grip section is, and it's not completely rounded. When I sort of feel around it, it's got an ever such a slight facet on here. It's not that noticeable, but it does again train you to hold the pen correctly, whilst giving you the appearance of having a pen which is perhaps a little bit more upmarket, I would say. Faber-Castell have been in operation for years and years and years. They're possibly, I think, Europe's oldest family, and one which is still owned by the same family members. So even though this pen isn't made in Germany, I have to say it is a really fantastic writer. And the steel nib on here, again, which you'll see in a moment, just writes absolutely wonderfully. With its all plastic construction, again, you could eyedrop this pen. So if you want to have a larger filling capacity, you can eyedrop it or put in their cartridge converter. So again, a fantastic value pen. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the Platinum Plaisir. So the Platinum Plaisir is a fantastic upgrade to the Platinum Preppy, which we have here. And we start getting into some more interesting colours with a clip and a clip done in metal, and we've still got this sort of very nice springy sort of inner section or inner cap, which basically stops your pen from drying out. We've got a translucent section here, which I think is quite fun, so you can see the ink sort of trickling down. You can really see the action of the ink coming through here, and with it being all plastic again, you can eyedrop it. Well, actually, no, it's not all plastic, so you can't eyedrop this. No, I make a mistake, sorry. I do apologise. You've got a metal inner section here, which is a bit of a shame, to be honest. I feel that had it been made out of plastic, it would have been better. And I've noticed actually on this particular model, actually getting it threaded can sometimes be a little bit challenging, all thanks to those metal threads. So maybe a plastic on plastic construction would have been a better choice for this pen. But you do get some really interesting colourways with this pen. And last but not least, going back to probably the cheapest pen in the lot, with the exception of these two pens, is from the infamous company that is Parker. Now, this was the pen of my yesteryears, not this exact pen, but I had an all silver version of this Jotter, and it was a lovely, lovely pen. £5 roughly, £5 to £10, depending on where you buy it from. Quite often in the sales, and they are absolutely fantastic. I mean, you do get a lot of stylish additions with this, with the arrow clip. There's nothing really to speak about on the finials. Its plastic construction isn't going to set the world on fire, but they come in fine and medium nibs, and they are really cheap to buy. And there's a recognisable manufacturer in which you can buy from your supermarket, your high street shop, or from your favourite online retailer, like Colt Pens. Hint, hint. So those are the pens in general. Let's now go over to the table and provide you with some writing. So ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to try and do these in price order. The Platinum and the Monami are roughly about the same price, but I'm going to start with the Monami here, and I'm going to just write in print today. And I'm going to do it in block capitals so we can see this quite clearly. So this is the Monami, and this has got a extra fine nib, which I'm going to designate by EF. Now you'll notice that actually on quite a lot of pens, they do actually put the nib designation on there, and it's just listed with the letter. Some companies like Platinum also use numbers on some of their pens as well. And this is a steel nib. And on this Rhodia paper, this pen behaves particularly well. I've tried this on Cosmo Air Light for those which are a little bit more knowing of fountain pen papers, and it has got a tendency to feather quite a lot, which is a bit of a shame. Okay, so what I'm going to do some dashes, and that will really highlight if there is any stubbishness to the actual nib, and there isn't, not on this particular one. So a stub is basically a nib which is like this, so you'll get thicker downstrokes like that, and then you'll get thicker downstrokes and then thinner upstrokes or horizontal strokes. Okay, so essentially if I was just to demonstrate that, if I just do a figure of 8, your downstrokes would have a little bit more flair to them. In fact, actually, what better to show you that with? I digress a little bit on this section, but I just feel it's actually important to talk about these as I go along. I've actually got a pen here which I wanted to show you in a future video. So you can see we get thicker downstrokes and thinner horizontal strokes, like so. But I will be showing you that video after I've done all these entry pens. So next up, we have got the Platinum Preppy. And it's a very, very smooth writer. This is supposed to be a fine nib, I believe. I will double check my invoice very quickly. I think it's supposed to be a fine. Yes, it is. Sometimes the numbering system throws me a little bit. So this is a Japanese fine, and you'll notice that this is very similar to the extra fine. Again, we've got some lovely horizontal and vertical strokes, as well as diagonal strokes. Very nicely tuned, and it's very smooth on this Rhodia paper as well. In terms of figure of 8, there's not going to be any variation, but if you're an artist, you're going to love the Preppy. It's a very affordable and cheap pen, and you can eyedrop this, so you can get a copious amount of ink in there. Next up, we're going to look at the Parker, and this has got a medium nib, and this is the Parker Jotter. And as you can see, we've got a slightly different amount of thickness going on here. You're not going to get any line variation out of this whatsoever, but diagonal strokes, horizontal and vertical strokes are beautiful with this. But all of these nibs are actually steel, so I'm not going to write down steel for each one of those. Okay, next up we have got the Kaweco Perkeo, and interestingly, this again is a medium nib. I think think I spelled that correct. I just need to double check. Yes, I have. Thank goodness. And this is a medium nib. It's not a pen which I've commonly used. But anyway, interestingly, the W, we pronounce that as Kaweco. Now, I have heard people from various countries around the world which aren't German speakers pronounce it as Kaweco. But no, it's Kaweco. So that's just a little bit of tidbit of information for you. And then we've got some lovely horizontal and vertical strokes. But what is particularly fun about this pen, guys, is we can actually put a little bit of pressure on there, and you'll see we're getting a little bit of line variation out of it. And as you can see, when we do these figure of eights, we're getting some beautiful, beautiful downstrokes on this pen, and you don't have to exert a lot of pressure for it. And again, beautiful diagonals, possibly slightly lighter on the upstrokes than on the downstrokes. In fact, actually, if I go up and then down, yeah, you can see that we're definitely getting a little bit more ink coming out on the downstrokes. But it writes absolutely phenomenally. Next up, we have got the Faber-Castell grip. And this is a broad. Now, in terms of smoothness, this isn't as smooth as the Kaweco, but it's still pretty good, and you can have quite a lot of fun with this. So I'm just going to write the B here just so I don't erase the actual page, and I'll just circle it so we know it's nothing to do with the name of the pen. So you'll notice that we're going to get some slightly thicker strokes with this pen. And again, we can exert a little bit of pressure and we can get a little bit of line variation out of this pen. Now the diagonal strokes are quite thin and they're not too dissimilar to the medium nib or the Perkeo, but it is a very pleasant writer. Next up, we have got the Lamy Safari, and this is in an extra fine. Now the reason why I'm writing in block capitals today is because if you are new to writing with fountain pens or new to writing in general, sometimes reading cursive writing can be tricky. So I'm just doing this in mind of any school child which is reading this which isn't used to actually using cursive. And you won't get any line variation out of this nib. It's very, very stiff. But if you do decide to go up to the 14 karat gold nib, which will set you back quite a pretty penny, you can get some very, very nice line variation out of it. But it's very smooth and is a lovely extra fine line. Now I've got one more test to do at the end of this, and I'm just going to demonstrate something which you can't necessarily do with all pens, but I'm going to just show you just one last thing. Okay, so last of all we have got the Platinum Plaisir. And I'm just going to check on the spelling of this so I get it right. Yeah. Wonderful. And again, we have got a fine nib. And interestingly, this fine nib is actually a little bit broader than that of the Preppy. But beautiful, beautiful, beautiful strokes on here. It's a very stiff nib. But it's a joy to use. So yeah, this is a really, really stunning nib. Sorry, I just literally ran out of space on the SD card, so Apologies for any interruption there at the end. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you things which you can't necessarily always do with every single fountain pen, but as an artist, something which I really appreciate, and that's something called reverse writing. Well, you'll notice that I'm now using the reverse of the nib. Okay, so as you can see, I'm not pointing it this way, I'm pointing it this way. So on some pens you can reverse with it, as opposed to perhaps, say, this nib here. Sorry, the same nib here, but facing forwards. We are getting a considerable difference in line width. And that really, as an artist, is absolutely invaluable, especially if you're doing some various pieces of fine detail. Not every single nib can do it. So, for example, on this Lamy Safari, it's already an extra fine, but this, I would say, is a little bit unusable. As you can see, we're getting scratches and then it starts running out. So that is just something to bear in mind. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to get back onto my face and then I'm going to close out the video with my final thoughts on what pens I would recommend. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so if you're a school student and you're wanting to try a fountain pen for the first time, I am going to recommend one of these two pens here. They're inexpensive, they're about £3–4, and they're not going to set your wallet on fire in terms of expense. And they are still considerably cheaper than some of the other entry pens which we have got. So at £3.49 versus £15 to £20 for these, possibly £12 I think for the Perkeo if memory serves. They are all very good. And what I will do is I am going to put a link in the description to Cult pens for all of these pens, which all are purchasable on there. So yes, have a look out for that. Now, as I say, you can eyedrop both of these pens as well. So if you do want to have a slightly larger filling capacity, you have got that as an option. And certainly with the Preppy? Certainly with the Preppy, you have got this beautiful little inner cap with a spring, which does give you the ability to have your pen not dry out, which is fantastic. And if you're a school student, you might be using a multitude of different pens and you might not necessarily use a fountain pen on a daily basis. So this is going to be a really good choice for those. Next up, I'd recommend one of these three pens here. Out of all these three pens, I love these two pens possibly the most, which is the Faber-Castell grip and the Perkeo. I still love the Lamy Safari and I've still owned two of these, but if we're talking about from a writing perspective, these two pens are going to give you a little bit of bounce, and certainly with both of them you can eyedrop them as well. So again, you can have a larger filling capacity should you choose to do so. The only disadvantage with the Perkeo is it doesn't come with a clip, and that may be an issue for you, but actually I think it's really nice. And of course, if you are into urushi and you want to upscale this a little bit, there's no reason why you couldn't find yourself your favourite urushi artist to see if you could challenge them to do some fantastic urushi work on here. Now, there are a lot of facets on here and some urushi artists may not accept it because polishing facets is a bit of a pain in the bottom. So that is something to bear in mind. But I would love to see this urushified. I think this would look just absolutely fantastic. Married with the fact that we have got this beautiful, beautiful beautiful nib. It is a really good pen, and one which I might see if someone would be up to urushifying in the future. Okay, out of these other two pens, I would still go with the actual grip, even though the colour choices are boring. I would say it's a slightly more comfortable pen to hold, and I love the actual nib on here. I love the fact that it is still very bouncy. It's just an all-round great pen. If, however, you are wanting to collect fountain pens, you're not going to beat the Lamy Safari, I'm afraid. A plethora, a cornucopia, if you will, of different colour choices are available for the lovely Lamy Safari, ranging from this year's homage to the terracotta or terra and the savannah green, and you've got special editions each year, so a very, very collectible pen. Last but not least, this pen is going to be a bit more difficult to recommend, just purely because it does offer exactly the same writing experience as that of the Preppy, But you do get yourself more interesting colour choices. You do get yourself a little bit more premium trim on here, and you do get yourself the, as I say, you do get more colour options. But the problem is with this pen is that you're not far off the cost of getting yourself a TWSBI Eco, or a TWSBI Go, if you will. Both have got really good filling mechanisms on there, both demonstrators, and I'd say slightly superior in that sort of price bracket to this pen. But again, you know, if you do like collecting colours, this is going to provide you a handsome choice of collections. Last but not least is the Parker Jotter. Oh, the Parker. Yes, the childhood pen of many people. It is a lovely pen, and it does write superbly. I'd say the medium nib is preferable to that of the fine. The fine nib can be a little bit dry to write with, and with certain inks it can be a bit more problematic. The medium, however, is a joy to write with, and certainly for £5 it's a step up from the Preppy in terms of aesthetics, but actually I'd still go with the Preppy, just purely because you can eyedrop it and you do get to see your ink levels in there as well. But again, you know, the Jotter is a collectible pen, and there are people which do collect Jotters out there, and it won't set the wallet on fire in terms of actually collecting these pens. Anyway, that brings me to the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content. Today's video is slightly longer because I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about the pen's mechanisms. If that has proved helpful, fantastic. If it hasn't, please be constructive with your feedback. I would appreciate that, and let me know what you would improve. So I shall see you next week. Till then, stay safe and goodbye for now.